So, thank you everyone for being here. The highlight of our conference, which has been a wonderful conference, I think, exceeded our expectations and wonderful discussions and papers. And it's my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Jonathan Israel. Now, I have a conundrum because if I start going all over all of the books and all of the research and all of the important things that Professor Israel has discussed and researched and written about, you won't have any time left to talk. So I'm going to make it very, very short. Professor Israel was educated at the universities of Cambridge, at Oxford, and also at the Colegio de Mexico. He was then for a couple of years a lecturer at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, and then for many years at the University of Hull, and then University College London. And then from 2001 until his retirement in 2016, he was professor, I don't remember the name.
Modern history.
Of modern history at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where he is now a professor emeritus and still very, very, very much active, makes much younger people like me feel almost useless. Always active, always writing, and always doing it at the highest level. Just to mention a few important things about Professor Israel's very wide range of interests. He began as a historian of colonial Mexico, then moved on to the history of Dutch history, but also in connection with colonialism, with mercantile and economic history, then began working on Jewish history. International Jewry in the Age of Mercantilism was a book that historians, I'm not a historian of Jewish history, but I know that it still today is a defining work. And then it continued with a lot of work on Dutch history, including the absolute best, I don't think ever will be replaced, a general survey of Dutch history that's ever been written. And then what interests us is today, Professor Israel began in 2002, I think it was, the Radical Enlightenment when it came out.
No, it began in the late 90s. It came out in 2001.
2001. So a book which absolutely revolutionized our understanding of the history of the Enlightenment. And then a long series of books which continued to develop this idea into the 19th century, eventually with a book which is very much relevant to our conference, The Enlightenment That Failed. And I would just end with a recommendation to you all. If you want to get a sense of the full range of Professor Israel's interests, just read his recent biography of Spinoza, Spinoza Life and Legacy. All of the topics that I've mentioned, colonial history, history of the Caribbean a little bit, Dutch history, Jewish history, and definitely the history of the Enlightenment. All of it is there combined together in this absolutely wonderful book. So with this, as I promised to be short, the stage is yours, Professor Israel.
I'm very, very grateful to have been here during this conference, and I thank the organizers, Nati and Tomasz, and everyone that helped them for arranging what has been a very, we all agree, an enjoyable and pleasant occasion, but very much an enriching occasion. And everyone here has learnt a lot that they didn't know beforehand, and that's great. The trouble is that we've had these enriching perspectives given to us on Poland, on the Czech lands, on Hungary, on parts of Germany, on Greece, and so on and so on. And all these different little vignettes, but linking them together is not all that easy, and all of us are probably struggling in our minds as to exactly how we do that. So what I want to rather too ambitiously probably try to do in my lecture is to look at the transitions between the Enlightenment era and the age of liberalism and see whether I can't find some narrative lines, grand narrative lines, if you like, that would provide a unifying role and function and help us gain some kind of perspective over the whole. At least it will be a perspective over the whole that we can debate and argue about, and that has some value in itself. So I've tried to look particularly at the period from Napoleon down to the 1830s. And the main thrust of this contribution is, partly by adopting Natty's characterization of the divide between moderate and radical liberalism to try to relate the different strands of liberalism to the different strands of Enlightenment. That's to say, moderate Enlightenment and radical Enlightenment, as they are still on the European scene down to Napoleon. So the central question is, how far was the tension between the two wings of early 19th century Western liberalism, in essence, just an extension, or is it not an extension, but a rerouting in some way of the two conflicting tendencies that shaped the Enlightenment, and how far has the transitioning that goes on in the early 19th century, in the period down to the 1840s, created or not created an essentially new framework? Well, everyone here will agree, I think, that the defeat of Napoleon in 1814-15 and the reconstituting of not just the European order, but they were very ambitious. They were intended to reorganize the entire world order of the Congress of Vienna in 1814-15. These gentlemen were determined to put an end to decades of revolution, turmoil, and upsetting, overturning of all previous criteria, and create a new stability, a new world order, a stable world order that was going to last. And this was something of decisive international and global importance. Four powers considered themselves the main victors over Napoleon, which is a bit unfair to Sweden and one or two other countries who also participated. But the four that made the New World Order quite clearly were Tsarist Russia, Britain, Habsburg Austria, and Prussia. And they wanted to create this new stability by imposing a conservative, pro-monarchical, pro-aristocratic, and pro-religious authority ideological order on European, Near Eastern and New World humanity. Slightly amusingly or paradoxically, I think the very concept of creating world stability on this basis forced them into certain liberal moves, which weren't really part of the calculation. But the only way they could, these four powers could together support religious authority as one of the main bastions of world stability was by saying, okay, maybe in the past Catholicism, Protestantism, and the Greek and Greco-Russian Orthodox world were in tension or in conflict with each other, but now they're going to work in harmony together to keep the whole world stable. So they created a new coexistence, you might say, between Protestantism, Catholicism, and the Russia-Greek Orthodoxy, which in one sense is a liberal move in itself, but of course it was part of this general conservative reaction. What is not sufficiently stressed about the world transforming Vienna settlement, as it's called, which was orchestrated, of course, by Count Metternich in Vienna, which is where most of the gathering and the discussions and the decisions that led to the New World Order took place, was the very far-reaching compromises that in the end had to be made between Napoleonic reform and the reactionary conservatism, which is what most of them, Metternich more perhaps than anyone else, were trying to restore. And I think the extent of the compromises, we should begin by saying, is much more fundamental and far-reaching than scholars have tended to assume. The Vienna Congress compromised with Napoleon's legacy most obviously by acquiescing almost entirely in the political, social and economic, and most importantly, the cultural transformation of large parts of, especially Central Europe, excluding Prussia and Austria, which now the old order was supposed to be restored, but the rest of Germany and Switzerland, for that matter, was supposed to be returned to a conservative order, but that proved to be impossible, and the same is true of Scandinavia and the Low Countries. And I'm going to say a few things about the situation in Germany, just to begin with. So there you see, in 1806, Napoleon he abolished the old Holy Roman Empire, which had more than 300 principalities, all kinds, dozens and dozens and dozens of little principalities disappeared forever. All the ecclesiastical states, some of which were quite big, like the Bisdom of Münster, for example, the Münsterland was quite large, or the Archbishop of Salzburg. These were all abolished. So he created a small confederation, which is more or less what the new Germany was, also re-established by the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So leaving Austria and Prussia out of it, Prussia was perhaps overly compensated with lots of new territory. There you see, that's the 1806 map. Of course, the blue state in the southern part there, that's Bavaria, obviously was the largest of the new kingdoms that Napoleon created. The southern part, the Tyrol and so on, went back to Austria, obviously, in 1815. But otherwise, they retained most of that. And all these other big kingdoms that have been created, Württemberg, Baden-Baden, the Grand Duchy of Hesse, the Kingdom of Hanover, and so on, these middle-sized states, most of which had been allies of Napoleon during the wars, and had introduced many, many far-reaching Enlightenment reforms, they couldn't reverse this. So whatever the claims of the Vienna settlement, however reactionary it was supposed to be, however big the territorial gains of Prussia and the recovery of Austrian Habsburg lands, never mind, the fact is that Germany was much more like Napoleon's 1806 Germany after 1815 than it was like the Holy Roman Empire, which had preceded the wars. What this meant, the implications of this were very, very extensive, because these states under French and Napoleonic influence had not only doubled and trebled. Bavaria must have been about 3 times as big as it was before the Napoleonic period, but they completely changed in their character. So Bavaria, since about 1803, had rapidly transformed from being literally the most reactionary to being just about the most liberal state in early 19th century Germany, maybe in the whole of Europe. Württemberg, the Grand Duchy of Hesse, and so on. These were all massively transformed by dozens and dozens of secularizing reforms, very, very extensive seizure of monastic and clerical properties on an enormous scale, complete reorganization of education. One could go on, because I think historians don't emphasize enough how fundamentally and profoundly the Napoleonic transformation in Europe and the related changes in the Low Countries and in Scandinavia changed the whole 18th century picture, how extensive this is and how really impossible. They could put up the flags and say how reactionary we're only going to support from now on monarchy, aristocracy and religious authority. That's it, because that's going to define everything. They could trumpet that as much as they like, but it just couldn't be done, and it didn't work. So I want to begin by stressing the remarkable progress of liberal constitutionalism, social reform, administrative reform, educational reform, and religious toleration post-1815. So that will be the first step in my argument. So if the more radically enlightened reformers supporting Napoleon were profoundly dismayed by the restoration of old dynasties, clerical power, and aristocracy, and lost much of their optimism in and after 1815, no less and perhaps even more disappointed, arguably, were the reactionary conservatives who had good reason to feel thwarted on multiple levels. Even in France, under Louis XVIII, there was widespread disappointment among the hardcore conservatives, the chief ideologues of authentic, real counter-Enlightenment thinking. I'm not suggesting that core reactionary conservatism in 1815 Europe was weak. Don't get that idea. It was pretty strong, and it had some formidable writers. A lot of them were French. Chateaubriand, de Maistre, de Lamennais, Bonald, and in Holland, that, excuse me, saying so, the slightly crazy man, Isaac da Costa. But these were very, very formidable, real reactionary conservatives. We don't want to hear anything except monarchy, aristocracy, and religious authority. The rest is rubbish, and the whole of the New World Order has to be based on that. But it's not based on that. So they were very, very unhappy, all these writers in France, Chateaubriand, de Maistre not least. Hardcore, repressive and reactionary monarchies subscribing to counter-Enlightenment values were simply too few. Spain was perhaps the country that came closest to it. Fernando VI was very reactionary. He brought the Inquisition back and did everything he could to meet the standards of the Vienna Congress world reaction. But even in Spain, there were problems, which I haven't really got time to go into. But in France, there were certainly very many. So now, nowhere in the bulk of Germany was the old order re-established in its entirety. But equally, it must be admitted, nowhere was the new order established by Napoleon fully retained. So reaction did regain some territory. Everywhere the result was a mix of the old order and the Napoleonic legal and institutional system. Nevertheless, many of the most important changes proved to be part of a continuing process. Serfdom was abolished throughout Napoleon's system in Western and Central Germany and in Denmark, even though it broadly survived in the eastern parts of the old Holy Roman Empire. But this process of abolishing serfdom didn't simply stop in 1815. It continued after 1815. Serfdom, for example, was formally abolished in Württemberg in 1817 and in Mecklenburg in 1820, though it took rather longer to fully complete the process in both cases. The systematic erosion of reaction and the Ancien regime characterizing post-1815 constitutional change in Germany is very well illustrated by the examples of the Grand Duchy of Hesse, which began to tilt significantly. Not only was it a compromise in 1815, but it tilted significantly more towards a more liberal constitutionalism well before the 1830 revolutions. The same in the Hessian Grand Duchy. Most dramatic of all, in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat, the Kingdom of Baden-Baden, that's the one in orange in the southwest corner there, which introduced a liberal constitution with a bicameral legislature in 1818, adopted equality before the law, and interestingly, equal status for the Lutheran, Reformed and Catholic churches. So let's take the newly expanded Grand Duchy, greatly increased in territory since before 1806, and let's consider that for a moment as one of two or three examples that I want to mention briefly by way of setting down some guidelines to help us figure out the best way to classify the transition from the essentially tripartite format of the 18th century, moderate Enlightenment, radical Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment. I should just say a word or two about the distinctions between moderate and radical Enlightenment, just to put a few labels up on the board. Probably quite a lot of people know there's been a surprising amount of controversy over this basic distinction between moderate and radical Enlightenment among historians. And although I don't think the criticisms of the schema are particularly good, and they're not really worth discussing, in my opinion, on this occasion, I don't know why so many historians join that bandwagon. It's in a way rather peculiar, because if you think about it, what is the Enlightenment trying to do? It's trying to introduce improvements and refinements and to make a happier world based on science and new ideas. So there are two ways of doing this. You can either you make repairs on the roof and on parts of the windows. Yesterday we had a marvelous paper on David Hume, and summing up in Hume's beautiful terminology, what you might call the evolutionary moderate approach. So you mend the window frames, you here and there a few repairs, but the house has the same shape. The basic shape is you must have the British. You can't imagine how strongly the British government were emphasizing this all the time in 1815. It's got to be monarchy. It's got to be, I mean, they were prepared to make compromises when Greece rebelled against the Turks in the 1820s. At first they just said, well, we're not accepting, no people is allowed to revolt against its sovereign. After 5 or 10 years, the British government, getting weary, said, okay, we'll let you be an independent country, so you don't have to be under the Turks. But you've got to have a king. And what's more, we'll choose your king for you. So Britain actually chose the Greek royal family in the late 1820s, and the Bavarian Prince Otto, I think was his name, who became the first king of Greece. It's got to be monarchy, it's got to be aristocracy, and it's got to be religious authority, where the church should have back all its educational and social role that it had before. That's the shape of the house. Well, if you're not changing the basic shape, that's moderate, but just, let's say, introducing a few, putting in some air conditioning, putting in a few improvements, that's moderate enlightenment. So you can either do it that way, or you can knock the whole house down and build a completely different building that looks totally different. So that is on new principles. So that is radical enlightenment. How could it not have been that way? Of course it had to be that way. There had to be a division between moderate and radical enlightenment. It's completely impossible, if you think about it, that there could have been any other way that the Enlightenment evolved, except in a tension, an incompatibility tension. So you can't really, in the end, compromise between moderate and radical. Either you knock the house down or you preserve the existing shape. But there isn't any in between those two things, or at least nothing very convincing as an in between. I should say that these opposing ideological tendencies in both the 18th and the 19th century into pro-monarchical and anti-monarchical, pro-aristocratic and anti-aristocratic, pro-religious authority and anti-religious authority, and also over whether only part of society needed to be educated and enlightened, or all of society, and whether it was not just deeply rooted and constant, but also a process that was both inevitable in itself and inevitably shifting in its contours, which I think probably we would mostly agree was the case. The entire argument about whether it makes sense to divide the Enlightenment into moderate and radical tendencies then itself doesn't seem to me to make any sense. I don't know why there is an argument about that, because it's entirely impossible for the Enlightenment not to have taken these incompatible and to some extent conflicting streams of moderate and radical enlightenment. That was never, I think, on the cards, and couldn't possibly have been on the cards. So obviously, for that reason, if no other, I greatly applaud the clarifying innovation in scholarship which Nathaniel Wolloch has introduced recently in terms, in my book, The Enlightenment That Failed. I was very rude about the use of the term liberalism, which I dismissed as completely useless. He has corrected me about that point. So now we are talking about moderate and radical liberalism in the 19th century. But at the same time, I still remain slightly hesitant about distinguishing in too marked a fashion between the liberal era of the post-Napoleonic liberal era and the Enlightenment down to Napoleon that preceded it. As Nathaniel Wolloch stresses in his conclusion, the comparison between the moderate and radical Enlightenments on the one hand, and moderate and radical liberalism on the other, and the utilization of this comparison to describe the transition from the 18th to the 19th century, clarifies the nature of both chapters in the history of political thought. Yes, absolutely, I agree. My question, though, is what is the significance, then, of the dividing line between Enlightenment and the age of liberalism? But come back to that at the end. But for now, let's turn to the question of the changes coming in. So you had, if you were a counter-Enlightenment thinker or writer in 1815, you had a very long list of reasons why you were thoroughly unhappy with this alleged reordering of the world on the basis of monarchy, aristocracy, and religious authority. And what's more, as we saw just now in the case of serfdom, it didn't seem to stop in 1815, but these liberal changes went on, especially in Central Europe and Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, by the way, which was the new monarchy in the Netherlands was very liberal, and none of the secularizing and liberalizing changes that came in whilst the Low Countries were absorbed into the French Empire down to 1815, really stopped after 1815. Actually, the Netherlands, one of our papers this morning was on the history of the Jewish Enlightenment. So just in connection with that, it's interesting, the Netherlands was the first country in Europe where you start to see Jews rising up to practically to government level into the higher administrative circles in running the country. That starts already very, very early in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. In the case of Kingdom of Baden and Baden, which I wanted to say a few more words about, it was strikingly liberal, most of all, by wholly excluding the principle of nobility from the lower house of the bicameral new legislature, which was the chamber that held most of the power. It was ultra-liberal, too, in other ways, including by formally equalizing the status of the Lutheran, Calvinist and Catholic churches, albeit this epoch-making Baden constitution did not grant equal rights to the Jews. So that was one respect in which it wasn't so ultra-liberal. But the question I want to ask here, but let's say Baden is ahead of the pack in a certain sense in the period between 1815 and 1820. Sweeping changes coming in, which are really quite remarkable and impressive. So let's ask, well, who is behind this dramatic liberalization in Baden-Baden? Let's get a bit more precise here. Was it introduced chiefly by the ruling dynasty, headed in 1818 by Grand Duke Karl Ludwig Friedrich from his palace in Karlsruhe? No. The dynasty felt itself in a weak position, finding absorption and organization of the hodgepodge of former principalities, lordships, imperial free cities, and ecclesiastical states extremely challenging and complicated and arduous and difficult. Was it the nobility? No, the nobility were not very keen on this change, and especially being left out of having any privileged position of power in the new legislature. In fact, many of the territorial lords in Baden-Baden were opposed to consolidation of the new Grand Duchy, which is giving them less status than they had had before. So it's not the crown in Baden-Baden, it's not the nobility. Was it the common people? Was it popular agitation? No. The peasantry and the townspeople were not interested in constitutions. They certainly wanted lower taxation and were willing to riot and demonstrate about that. But beyond lower taxation, they really didn't much care about the new state and how it was organized. Well, that leaves us with a bit of a question. Who then did bring in this startlingly liberal constitution of 1818 in Baden? The answer is that it was introduced by non-noble, university-trained civil servants like Karl Nabenius, who was the son of a Baden magistrate who had studied law and economics at Tübingen University. He did it on purpose, excluding the nobility and all churchmen from any position in the legislature, because this is how he thought things should be organized, producing a legislature dominated by upper bourgeois and highly educated types like himself. So at this point, let me say, if university-trained graduates are now playing such a prominent role, here is something that is really rather different, I think, from the Age of Enlightenment. It's not different in essence, in core values or in the use of ideas or the kind of ideas at play. It's different simply in the social impulse behind it. One of the biggest changes of the Enlightenment, this came up briefly in discussion this morning, was the old-style universities continued through most of the 18th century, but they tended to collapse, especially in the revolutionary period at the end of the 18th century and in the Napoleonic period. You have a massive transformation and a whole group of new universities which are much, much bigger and diversified. They now teach a much wider range of courses. And so this is true in Berlin. The great University of Munich begins in this period of Bonn, begins in this period. The Brussels University, which didn't exist before this period either. The same in Amsterdam didn't have a university before this period. So lots of new universities which are set up, which are much bigger and completely overshadow the older universities. London, a little bit behind, but University College, I was reminded just now, where I once taught for quite a long time, more than 20 years, was created in exactly 200 years ago in 1826. And among, I'm going to show Bentham in a moment because he's one of the principal thinkers of this period who moves to a much more radical frame of mind during the transition period that we're discussing. But it was based on Benthamite principles. And just look at it. Teaching modern languages, which no university did before this period. You didn't teach French and Italian and stuff like that in universities in the 17th and 18th centuries. Teaching all the sciences in a much more systematic way than had been done before. And what was most scandalous to hardcore reactionary types, this is typical of Bentham, what do you need a theology department for? No, on principle, no theology. That's enough to make a true Viennese settlement person who is supporting reaction faint with horror, needless to say. Universities in the late Middle Ages down to the 18th century basically only taught theology and law. Then you don't have to think about new ways of doing things. That's the great advantages of theology and law, with maybe a bit of philosophy. But the philosophy had to be restricted to what fits within theology. Nothing that clashes with theology was allowed in any philosophical faculty in Europe. So it's extremely narrow, the range of university study. And now that is completely revolutionized. For some reason, this dimension didn't come in much to our discussion during the conference, but it seems to me one of the most important things as a social driver of what was going on in Europe in the period immediately after 1815. So we see this dramatic liberalization going on, which is not being pushed by the court, it's not being pushed by the nobility, it's not being pushed by the people. This is very important. It's being pushed by university graduates, journalists in particular, and this is a whole new kind of social and intellectual framework and context. But that means that the essential changes of the period around 1820 and in the 1820s was driven by a small clique, a relatively small part of society, rooted in Enlightenment thinking, adopting several radical tendencies from the past, but doing so now to stabilize and consolidate power, administration, and dynasty in a fundamentally transformed social and political context, which fits in actually quite well with your approach to liberalism. This then would appear to be a clear precursor reflecting what Nathaniel Wolloch terms the tangible difference between moderate and radical enlightenment in the 18th century, whereas in the 19th century, the distance between moderate and radical liberalism, which he argues is much less pronounced, was the direct result of the fact that ever since the late 18th century, it was often moderates who ended up accepting and eventually promoting radical notions. Well, this was certainly a deep-seated pattern we recognize also from the examples of the new Kingdom of the Netherlands, which I mentioned before, the reforms in the Dutch colonial empire, which are quite important in the 1820s and 30s, and other notoriously liberal early 19th century European monarchies, like the new kingdoms of Sweden, where there were lots of reforms in this period, Württemberg and Bavaria. Now, I've had a passage on Bavaria, which, for reasons of time, I will cut out from my lecture. And let me say that for anyone living in Central Europe, France, Scandinavia, or the Low Countries in the late teens and the early 1820s, there was good reason to feel that this was a time of cautious optimism, despite the ascendancy for now of more obviously reactionary tendencies in Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. But also in Spain and Italy, where Spain and Italy were perhaps the two countries where the reversal of tendencies was most obvious. A striking example of the more optimistic mood among Europe's liberals in the years around 1820 is the speech on modern liberty that Benjamin Constant delivered on the nature of modern liberty, which he gave this speech in Paris at the new Athénée Royal in February 1819. There's Bentham, who I'll come back to later. I said a word or two about him. Just let me say before I go on that Bentham was one of those who had been very much a moderate Enlightenment type, I would say, for most of his career in the late 18th century. But he didn't like the way, as the Allies started to get the upper hand after Napoleon's defeat in Russia, between 1812 and 1815, he kind of radicalized because he didn't like the way everything was being changed in Germany and Switzerland and so on. And he ends up by being one of the most radical Enlighteners by the 1820s. By the time his college is founded in London, one of the most radical education reformers, and one of the most radical legal reformers. Of course, he's most famous for his proposed legal reforms, but a very important figure. He's another, like Bentham and some others I'm going to mention, he's a clear example of somebody who is moving from moderate Enlightenment to radical Enlightenment. In that speech in 1819, looking back on the French Revolution, it's striking that Constant did not hesitate to call it notre heureuse révolution. Je l'appelle heureuse malgré ses excès parce que je fixe mes regards sur les résultats. A revolution I call it a happy revolution despite its excesses because I'm fixing my regards, my attention on the outcome, on the results. A revolution that brought France under a constitution and under representative government, because now you had a parliament in Paris who shared power with the king. Constant's obvious optimism in 1819 was based on a feeling that the concert of European powers had generated a new tendency towards peace instead of war and had entrenched enlightened values and created a threshold from which humanity was likely to progress, to elevate itself to a higher level. Above all, against Mably and Rousseau, he prized the dawning universality of what he termed la liberté individuelle, which he called le premier des besoins modernes. However little appetite the European monarchies of 1819 had for republics, republicanism, and the republican spirit, the fact was Constant rightly insisted, it seems to me, that the European monarchies of 1819 were adopting certains usages républicains, certain republican usages which were working in favor of individual liberty, constitutionalism, and freedom of expression. He believed the French Revolution had opened the door to what was now chiefly required, the moral elevation of the citizenry, teaching them to value and respect their individual rights, to manage their personal independence, without troubling their everyday work and occupations, learn to peaceably exert their influence by expressing their views and voting on the exercise of power. For aspiring new social groups, above all the burgeoning number of university graduates, especially graduates of new and recently reformed universities like Berlin, Munich, Bonn, Brussels, Amsterdam, the ones I mentioned before, and the various new institutes of higher education in Paris, there was room for optimism, and it may even have seemed it was time to sit back, relax, and wait for monarchy, aristocracy, and church authority and censorship just to gradually erode away of their own accord. But the later 1820s presented a different, darker picture. The new King of France, Charles X, who reigned from 1824 to August 1830, was a more radical absolutist than his brother Louis XVIII, determined to prune back the constitutional concessions his brother had made, and he succeeded to a degree in strengthening absolute monarchy, aristocracy, censorship, and unremitting church authority. He got some territories back to the... He was very disappointed he couldn't get that much back for the bishops and the monasteries, but he got something back for them. And it was unremitting church authority, bringing about a marked change in French life. In Bavaria, following the death of King Maximilian and the succession of King Ludwig I, the famed lover of mysticism, miracles, and the Middle Ages, there was considerable apprehension, although it actually little changed at first. But the general tendency in the late 1820s was to retreat from or stall the progress registered by Enlightenment ideology down to the mid-1820s, and for frustration among liberals to start building up. It was a situation that plunged European liberalism into renewed crisis for many groups that had experienced definite improvements and release from the restrictions of the past, which now suddenly found themselves being increasingly debarred, doors being closed, and opportunity pruned back. In this context of the late 1820s, on the threshold of the revolutions of 1830, three groups were especially prone to feel alienated and become radicalized on the basis of liberal ideology. University students, who played a huge role in 1830 and 1848 revolutions, journalists, who were also extremely prominent, and Jews, who were starting to become quite prominent in revolutionary turmoil, representing together a relatively narrow segment of society, admittedly, but very much the hardcore of the opposition liberal movement. But in the circumstances of 1830, and here we turn again to the crucial issue of classification, angry young students, journalists, and Jews and their allies had two choices, assuming one totally rejected the Counter-Enlightenment ideology relentlessly proclaimed by Metternich, Charles X, King Ludwig, the British government, until 1832. In 1832, when the Whigs came to power in the British Parliament and the Great Reform Act was passed, the reactionary mood that had been dominated Britain since the 1790s to 1832, Britain was thoroughly, utterly, totally against all revolution, all liberalism, and they only wanted to hear about crown aristocracy and church authority as well. They were as reactionary as Russia until 1832. They were very, very reactionary. But all that was going to change soon. And either you stand up and help defend the principle of enlightened reformist monarchy, founding new universities, libraries, constitutions, and relaxing state censorship and church authority, making you an heir to the moderate Enlightenment, or your liberalism drove you to a more radical position, and that's what we see happening in the later 1820s. To be a radical liberal in 1830 meant that you were turning, like Constant, against the ruling dynasties you had previously been willing to support a decade earlier. So in 1815 or 1819, Constant is willing to go along, and he sees a lot of good in the compromises that are being made. But by the late 1820s, he adopts a more radical position, which seems to me the direction of things in the 1820s, which is a little different from Natty's analysis. So these figures, Bentham is radicalized. Sismondi was another. I want to say a few things about him as I come towards closing my lecture in a few minutes, because Sismondi, for much the same reason, he'd been very much a moderate enlightener, an important economic thinker, an important figure, well before, in the 1780s, 90s. He had his reservations about Napoleon, but what he especially disliked was the way the Allies completely or tried to reorganize the Swiss Confederation in 1814 and 1815, which completely alienated. So Sismondi, it seems to me, the hard core of, this wouldn't apply to de Tocqueville, of course, who's one of those that you most emphasize. But what I think of as the hard core of the liberal thinkers, or at least a large part of the hard core, there are others that I'm going to mention in a moment, but Bentham, Constant, and Sismondi alone already are forming a pretty hard core, I would say, who illustrate this shift, which I'm trying to profile, of okay, we're moderate Enlighteners will go along with the compromises of 1815, and then by the 1820s saying, well, none of this is good enough. We want more radical positions, and adopting a certain political activism, which is rather important. Constant's activism, Sismondi's activism. Bentham, I mean, he may be basically a philosopher and a theorist, but his pamphlets and his active interventions were really rather important. Simon Bolivar came to see him shortly before embarking on his revolutionary course in South America, and Bentham's ideas had a certain impact across the Atlantic in Spanish America, and definitely when as liberals began to protest and to make movement against the reaction in Spain, which, as I mentioned, was very strong in the 1820s, Bentham was one of the most, translated into Spanish, of course, was one of the most inspiring and one of the most active streams of thought in prodding Spaniards to adopt more radical liberal positions in the 1820s, rather important. Also in the Greek Revolution, I mentioned that Greece was shaped, as it were, in part by the British government, made sure that it had a monarchy and so on, and aristocracy. But there were Greeks who were not very happy with any of this, and Greece was another country in a revolutionary mood and in turmoil in the 1820s, where again Bentham has a big impact. So these thinkers are not just they're not just cafe intellectuals, and you look at their books in cafes and discuss them as interesting liberal intellectuals. No, they're having a concrete impact on what is actually going on and what is happening. So on the threshold of the revolutions of 1830, three groups were especially prone to feel alienated and become radicalized on the basis of liberal ideology: university students, journalists and Jews, representing together a relatively narrow segment of society, as I said. To be a radical liberal in 1830 meant that you were turning, like Constant, against the ruling dynasties you had previously been willing to support. And it seems to me that this is part of a wider process that we need to take very, very firmly in mind. If we then ask, does this three-part designation characterizing the revolutions of 1830 into the reactionary tendency, moderate liberalism and radical liberalism, does this three-part designation for the revolutions of 1830 differ in essence from the three-part designation of the 18th century, setting moderate Enlightenment against radical Enlightenment and both wings of the Enlightenment against the Counter-Enlightenment of faith, divine right, absolutism and the hegemony of churches over society? The answer is that it doesn't, in essence, really change, it seems to me, the framework of the 18th century Enlightenment. And although I only very slightly disagree with my esteemed colleague, Wolloch, about this, who's argued at great length that while during the 18th century the difference between radical and moderate Enlightenment ideas was substantial, and he also argues that during the early 19th century age of liberalism, I quote, "The gulf between moderation and radicalism narrowed, the distance between moderate and radical liberals shrunk, while radicals embraced the agenda of the," not radical enlighteners, but by radicals here, I think you mean the anarchists and the people to the left of the radical liberals who embraced the agenda of the socialist left and went beyond any part of the liberal program. The implementation of radical ideas, Wolloch writes, was not in most cases achieved by the radicals themselves, but rather by moderates. This was rarely a premeditated approach, he adds. In most cases, it was an unintended and even unconscious process. It seems to me difficult to altogether accept this view if one examines the mechanics of the revolutions of 1830 in France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and Denmark. Rather, the division between moderate and radical, my view, was broadly the same in 1830 as during the 18th century, a continuation of the older format, though admittedly the cases of Belgium and Poland, where nationalism played a larger role than in the other countries, is rather different. But I won't go into that now. So what had chiefly changed in the moderate sphere was that enlightened despotism as a tool of progress had now broadly been discarded to be replaced by constitutional monarchy limited by a two-chamber legislature with an upper chamber, as was then also the case in the United States and Britain. In most cases, not in Baden-Baden as we saw before, but in most cases a chamber, the upper chamber, unelected and strong enough to counterbalance the elected lower chamber. Here, in many respects, de Tocqueville was the classic voice of moderate liberal caucus, being a political and social reformer. De Tocqueville came up quite a bit during our conference. So although in what I hope will be eventually the printed version of this, there's a paragraph or two about de Tocqueville, I'm going to skip that now. So here was 1830, here was a clash between a moderate and radical liberalism, and it was a situation that plunged European liberalism into a renewed crisis for many groups that had experienced definite improvements. By the way, I've left Constant on the screen for quite a while. I want to bring Sismondi on because for some reason he's dropped out of the discussion. He's not as famous as Bentham or de Tocqueville, but he seems to me one of the most important figures on the liberal horizon during the period we're discussing, a man who has a great deal to say about republics, about Switzerland, about the way the Vienna Congress have worked, what is happening to Europe as a whole in this period, and about its economic and social life, and on one or two other points about Sismondi that I'll come to soon. But here we have, in this context, in the circumstances of 1830, I think the issue of classification is rather important because, these angry young students and journalists and others, they had two choices, assuming one totally rejected the Counter-Enlightenment ideology, as I've said, and that was to take the moderate or the radical course. Now, to be a radical in 1830 meant that, like Constant, you were turning against monarchy and the royal dynasties. And although nationalism was undoubtedly a new force hovering in the background, liberalism in 1830 was still clearly, and I believe that, historians have tended to, especially in Poland, it's true that nationalism very rapidly becomes a major driving force, more important perhaps than anything else, already in the 1820s and 30s. But I think especially when it comes to Germany, Belgium, Italy, I think there's been a tendency to somewhat exaggerate the importance of nationalism as compared to liberalism. I don't think that on the whole, in Germany, having studied some of the local revolutions, nationalism was as important as German historians have often argued it was. In any case, although nationalism was undoubtedly a new force hovering in the background, liberalism in 1830 was still the main driving force behind the revolutionary movement, and it's worth glancing for a moment at the most exemplary celebration of radical liberalism of the age, that fascinating event, the Hambacher Fest of 1832, and especially the agenda of its best-known organizer, Georg August Wirth, who was the editor of the Deutsche Tribune and co-founder of the Deutsche Vaterlandsverein zur Unterstützung der freien Presse. Working in Bayreuth, it's noteworthy that Wirth began his career as an opposition liberal journalist by criticizing the backtreading of the Bavarian government, who was just one of the most advanced in Germany. What he stood for principally was denouncing the tyranny of nobility and princes. So here we see, this is, with Wirth and the Hambacher Fest, we're seeing radical liberalism at work with the voice of nationalism as very much at the margin. That's not what it's about. It's about liberalism, not nationalism, the Hambacher, even if some German historians have tried to give a different impression. That's not correct. And here is an opposition journalist. What is he basically rebelling against? Princes, kings, nobility, and church authority. So what is the basic difference then from the radical Enlightenment in the 18th century? Well, I don't think there is one, really. Rather than radicals becoming more moderate during the 1820s and 30s and the liberal movement in opposition gradually expanding across Europe, the scene was littered with former moderates becoming more radical. So we've seen Jeremy Bentham, we've said something about Sismondi, we've said something about Benjamin Constant, but there are other very important examples. The young Hegelian philosophical critic Arnold Ruger, in his important article A Self-Critique of Liberalism of 1843, exactly captured the disgust of many left-leaning Germans in the post-Napoleonic era with what they considered the blindness and passivity of the German populace and the middle class in particular. I quote, "In our perverse, deeply and unspeakably confused Germanness, the people altogether acquiesced and submitted to what amounted to a royalist aristocratic swindle. In 1813 and 1815, states Ruger, the Germans did not think at all, and we will still have to pay for our thoughtlessness." Arnold Ruger typified those who... yeah, I think it's worth waiting for a moment to put him on the board, because certainly in the German-speaking world, he exactly exemplifies radical liberalism as opposed to moderate liberalism, but in opposition. Of course, he had a severe clash later with Karl Marx, and he would never go along with the socialists and Marxists and agree that the economic issue, though he thought economic issues are important, he would never agree that that was the central issue, which he saw more as constitutional, legal, etc., etc. And I think he's another example of what I'm calling this core of radical liberals in the 1820s, 30s and 40s who are rebelling against a European order built on compromise in 1815. Equally antagonistic to the courtly and the popular and the true definition of radical liberalism, after becoming involved in the German student agitation of 1821-4, he was imprisoned for years in the great Prussian fortress of Kolberg on the Lower Oder. Eventually released, he was spent years in prison. Ruger became a leading figure in the intellectual life of Halle, and until his editing work and other activities were again suppressed in 1843. After that, from 1843, he led a life of exile in France and Switzerland. A young Hegelian philosopher, he agreed with Hegel that history is the realization of human freedom, but gave the latter's dialectical concept a more subversive leftist twist. In 1843, in Paris, together with his then friend, for a while he worked together with the young Karl Marx, he founded the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, the German-French yearbooks, staunchly adhering, in his case, to the international subversive underground, but increasingly disagreeing with Marx's stress on class warfare and the primacy of economic factors. He just didn't accept that. A tireless publicist and later the editor of Die Reform, he remained among the most radical of the German Democrats of the 1830s and 40s. Well, I now have some paragraphs from Shelley, which I'm going to skip, on Grove Jones, which I think I should skip. I think I should just come to a passage about discussion of America in the 1830s and 40s. America is just becoming the first Western democratic society, and a few remarks about that and about Sismondi, and then try to wrap up, if I can, just in a brief period so that we have some time for discussion. So another aspect of the liberalism's predicament and the discussions of the 1820s and 30s was the nagging question, was the United States genuinely, certainly the first Western society becoming democratic, was the United States genuinely the one inspiring and positive model available to left-leaning Europeans that admirers like Tom Paine, Grove Jones, Marc-Antoine Julien, and many others claimed. Was the United States the only major, stable, free republic where liberty enlivens all institutions, as Marc-Antoine Julien put it in his Revue Encyclopédique? America did not need either a revolution or any drastic shift to set her on the path towards democracy. But post-1815 Europe most certainly did, and so couldn't America be a model for Europe? So a striking example of this truth, which was highlighted in particular by Marc-Antoine Julien, was the Enlightenment's and Napoleon's scheme for the rapid emancipation and integration of the Jewish population into society in the European Old World. Now, one respect in which, even in the case of Baden, the 1815 Vienna settlement was rather successful in turning the clock back and imposing a reactionary order on Europe, was that Jewish disabilities, that's to say exclusion, legal exclusion from participation in law, in government, appearing in court, testifying against Christians, all kinds of disabilities, that they couldn't be members of parliament and so on and so forth. These were, even in Baden, as I mentioned, these were largely restored. But Julien thought that was pretty bad, and that a systematic radical liberal like himself had to oppose that. And in the Old World, the rigid segregation excluding Jews from European life, which had largely been demolished by Napoleon, but then restored by the Vienna Congress, had been got rid of in America. Of course, Old World prejudices persisted in the United States too, and not all the barriers to Jewish integration had yet been removed. Even there, in Maryland, for instance, Julien noticed Jews were still legally debarred as Jews from holding. You were not allowed to hold any public office if you were Jewish in Maryland, even in the 1830s. But anyway, that was disappearing. But in the United States, such lingering institutionalized remnants of prejudice, bigotry, religious zeal, and counter-enlightenment were already the focus of organized protest meetings. They were residual vestiges that would disappear step by step, not pillars of an entire resurrected system of reactionary thought and practice. In America, anti-Semitism was not, as in continental Europe in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, an integral component of a restored social, religious, and political value system backed by a concert of international powers, seconded by the might of the British and Russian empires, that could be challenged only by revolutionary force. The America venerated by radical Republicans in the 1820s and 30s, though, was not the actual America familiar to the inhabitants of the United States. Rather, their America was a democratic Republican abstraction, a remote ideal, the vanguard of what the Revue Encyclopédique in the 1820s still routinely dubbed the advance of l'esprit philosophique. I'm very interested in this phrase, which Condorcet and other radical enlighteners of the 1770s and 80s were so fond of, the advance of l'esprit philosophique, which is the intellectual tendency which had revolutionized Europe and will continue to revolutionize Europe as these philosophical liberals saw it. And Julien and the principal contributors to his journal encyclopédique, that's to say Jean-Baptiste Say, Sismondi, come back to him again, and the Abbé Grégoire, meant the slow march of mankind towards what we would call modernity and universal equality and universalism of peoples. Their goal was democracy, republicanism, and equality, including an element of economic redistribution combined with universal secular education over which churches have no control, and drastically curbing all ecclesiastical authority. In other words, theirs was still the old ideology of Condorcet and the Brissotins. Seems to me, a radical ideology of the late Enlightenment laced, as in Michelet, with condemnation of the dictatorship of Robespierre and the Montagne, no less than that of Napoleon and the Restoration. Deplorably, complained Julien in October 1828, most teachers and most of France's education system were not infused with or directed by l'esprit philosophique, but instead by pedantic, traditional and Catholic notions, rendering French education under the restored throne leaden, boring, incapable of giving students a sense of the general direction of things, and incapable of motivating youth in the right direction. In fact, this radical Enlightenment ideology, forged in Europe before 1789, had never before become so widely diffused and cosmopolitan. Although in the case of Hungary, as we heard in a very interesting lecture yesterday, all the radical Enlightenment texts, there were a lot of translations of Enlightenment texts in Hungary. I think we were talking principally about the 1830s. But not these radical texts. So one of the biggest differences, there are lots of defining differences, as everyone can see clearly now. Moderate Enlightenment and radical Enlightenment are two very different things. And one of the biggest differences is that moderate Enlightenment is always okay. Kings and churches say, well, if you want to change things, that's the way to go. Radical Enlightenment is always not okay and always forbidden. And every censorship in Europe, practically, even in Holland, although you could use Switzerland, but you could usually get away with printing these forbidden texts there. Radical Enlightenment is forbidden. But now it's becoming easier, not in Hungary maybe, but in other parts of Europe and in France, these texts are. So this radical Enlightenment ideology forged in Europe before 1789 had never before become so widely diffused and cosmopolitan as it became diffused through the exiles, networks and student societies in the 1820s. I really must cut some more, and I really must stop in a moment. But I just want to say that the truth was, though, Sismondi did object to some of this discussion. The truth was that America differed from the prevailing Western pattern, not in most respects, but by leaving the lowest class of American society, the black population, languishing in abject slavery, this, in Sismondi's view, made American society even more wretched than the most, or a large part of American society, even more wretched than the most oppressed elsewhere. More miserable than the slaves of ancient Greece and Rome, he says, more miserable than the serfs of Russia and Poland. In the United States, the oppressiveness of slavery was aggravated by hatred and suspicion of the black race, so that even after several generations, the freed slave cannot attain a status of equality with the oppressor. There were 1.5 million slaves in the United States, according to the latest statistics, noted Sismondi, and another 250,000 or so free blacks, so nearly 2 million out of a total of 9 million inhabitants of the United States in 1827. It's amazing the US only had 9 million in 1827, but that's how fast things change. Since 1775, the blacks had consistently constituted over 20% of American society, and while the total number of inhabitants had roughly trebled since the onset of the American Revolution in 1775 and already surpassed that of Britain, the proportion that was black and oppressed was broadly the same as in 1775, or even bigger. It is necessary to say it, concludes Sismondi, it was for the Republicans of the United States, who have long possessed their liberty, enlightenment, and a fraternal religion, to set an example of humanity and benevolence, but they have done exactly the contrary. Racial prejudice is more offensive, shameful, and cruel in the United States, even than in the new Spanish-American republics. Of course, Sismondi's analysis was met by a storm of protest. I won't go into that, but just let me say that in concluding and summing up, these quarrels and these exchanges and these discussions are a continuation of Enlightenment debates as they were in the 1780s and 90s in many ways. I think you cannot understand these debates amongst the liberals, such as I've tried to profile them a little here, without dividing between moderate and radical liberalism. So there, Nathaniel Wolloch and I are totally agreed. But I must say, I don't see the shift in contours as being as extensive and as being as significant as he sees it as being, to a large extent, it seems to me, what we see in the 80s, 30s and 40s, if we look at these liberal debates, is essentially a continuation of what you had before. Of course, circumstances have altered considerably, but nevertheless, essentially a continuation and an extension. And that leaves me with the question, is there really such a great difference between the situation in the 18th century when we speak about the dichotomy between moderate and radical enlightenment, and between the 1820s, 30s, and 1840s when we speak about the tension and dichotomy between moderate and radical liberalism. I apologize for going on for so long. Thank you.
I have a lot that I could say. I won't say everything that I have because that will take longer than your paper, than your presentation. But I want everyone here that wants to say something, to ask something. Really, including the students, don't be shy, and let's have a really lively debate. So who's first? Come on. One thing I can tell you about Professor Riswell, he is one of those great scholars who has that humility and amiability with students, with colleagues. He's not going to bite you. I might, but he won't. So who wants to begin?
I really enjoyed the paper, and actually I found very interesting the way that you extended your own taxonomy from the moderate radical enlightenment to the moderate radical liberalism of the 19th century. So I want to know first, why do you think that Benjamin Constant is a radical form of liberalism? In many, of course, there are signs of radicalism in his thought, but he was quite anti-democratic. In many, he believed strongly that we need gradual reforms and that the people in France are more or less risky political subjects. So we have to be very, very careful and moderate in the way that we give rights to the people, the way that a lot of reformists during this period were claiming. So I was wondering, because he is maybe anti-autocrat, anti-aristocratic, of course, but not really democratic.
Well, it depends how you think of democratic. Of course, democratic is a complicated idea. I think it is true of the radical Enlightenment from the very beginning. If you go back to Johann de la Cour, Franciscus van den Enden, Spinoza, in the Cercle Spinoziste, let's say, the Dutch thinkers who really start this radical course in the 1660s and 1670s, that they see the enemy of liberty, freedom, constitutional freedom, and the kind of equality they're interested in as being not just kings, churchmen, and nobles are three principal enemies, but actually there are four, because the common people who are ignorant, they are violent, and their dissatisfaction can disrupt society and cause instability. So I don't think and that applies also to radicals during the French Revolution. I don't think that D'Holbach is still before the revolution, but Condorcet and Brissot and so on, I don't think they're particularly keen on popular violence or uprisings for their own sake. Spinoza, of course, says in one place that the greatest enemies of society, that your own citizens can be the greatest enemies of society, and that the good ones are few. That's, of course, a famous maxim of Spinoza. So he thinks that the stability and well-being of society doesn't depend on the opinions of the majority. So in that sense, they're not particularly democratic. But they strongly believe that you need to extend awareness and education, because the more people who understand the reality of things, the more stable society will become. So they're democratic in the sense that they want the maximum proportion of society possible to be educated and highly educated as far as possible. They're democratic in the sense that they want the happiness and well-being, or what in the late 18th century in France they call. Remember, it's not Rousseau who invents the term volonté générale. It's actually Diderot and D'Holbach who have a different conception. But what they, whereas I think Rousseau basically means by volonté générale the will of a people, the direction in which they want to bring things through impulse, tradition, their feelings. It's a question of sentiment, really, for Rousseau. What Diderot and D'Holbach mean by volonté générale is what a philosopher who sits down and says, now, what's the best arrangement for society as a whole? We want to benefit society as a whole. What will give us the best, general l'utilité générale, as D'Holbach puts it in one case. It's the well-being of society as a whole is a democratic concept, and that is absolutely central to the Radical Enlightenment program. So they don't sit down and talk about, how are we going to organize the franchise? Are we going to let women vote or not, and so on? These things are discussed, but they're rather marginal compared to these other issues. What they really mean by democratic is that the political and legal system should be organized not for the glory of the king, not for the well-being of the church, but for the well-being of society. That society as a whole, without giving any privileged status to the nobility, that is democratic thinking for them. So does that answer your question partly?
Absolutely. I just think that Benjamin Constant and those people are more prone to promote middle class conception of democracy and not further than this.
Well, I don't think it's the middle class. They're not necessarily particularly enamored with merchants or the affluence of the middle class, but the intellectual elite, yes, because they think the intellectual elite are the people who understand things.
Thank you very much. It was really thoughtful. My question is just about that comparison and that extension that you made of the division and the cleavage between moderates and radicals in the two periods. But there are some differences too at a particular level that I think that maybe will have to make you take a reconsideration of your traditional approach now that you move into the 19th century, because the division between moderates and radicals in the 18th century cannot have the political dimension that it takes in 19th century. How did that affect, and how did that affect the way they saw the whole tradition of radicalism versus modernism of 18th century? Liberalism has a political dimension that clarifies spaces at a different level that it happened in the 18th century, where one has to assume that was more an intellectual phenomenon, just a phenomenon at that time.
I think it is true that in the 1820s, many or most liberals were willing to see the state, had a certain optimism about the future of the state. With states like Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden-Baden moving in this direction, it was possible to feel optimistic that the state itself could achieve liberal goals. Perhaps there was more of that feeling than in the 18th century, but I'm not wholly convinced of that, because, the difference between Voltaire's or Diderot when he was younger. I think Diderot became a classic radical enlightener in his older years when he was more politically conscious. But at an earlier stage, he focused his radicalism mainly on mainly in the form of his atheism and in his rejection of religious authority and the church. And I think, especially with his arrangements with Catherine the Great of Russia, you can see that he was willing to collude with enlightened despotism. No, I think he was always opposed to Frederick the Great of Prussia, and not many. even Voltaire had his problems with Frederick the Great, and not many of the radical enlighteners were very sympathetic to Frederick the Great. But Catherine did clearly, at least for a time, not later when she became more reactionary in the after 1789. But I think, in the 1770s, they were willing to go along with Catherine the Great's enlightened despotism. And is that really so different from the attitude of liberals in the 1820s and 30s? It seems to me it's not really in any essential way very different.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the broader picture that you brought us this afternoon. And I'm going to ask you about periodization. Would you say that 1789 is the end of the Enlightenment, or maybe 1815, or maybe later? Because you showed us, and it was so convincing, the continuity between the radical Enlightenment from the 18th century to the liberal and to the radical liberalism of the 1820s and 1830. So why don't you call it Enlightenment? What is so different in the later period of the 19th century? And my last question: what is the role of Romanticism in your broader picture?
Okay. Well, in the Enlightenment that failed, I was not, I'm not then aware of Nathaniel Wolloch's arguments about liberalism. I had no preview, let's say, of what he was going to write about this. And I was very dismissive of the term liberalism in that book. And I really was suggesting that the Enlightenment goes on as long as this kind of moderate and radical liberalism, which is stressing, let's say, a constitutional democratic program rather than adopting nationalistic or socialistic programs. But after 1848, the socialists, the anarchists, and the nationalists are really dominating the show. And I think this kind of liberalism, radical liberalism, which I see even Karl Marx as, I would describe him as a radical liberal till he plunges into economic theory, which he doesn't really do much before 1848. He's just starting to do that then. But after 1848, so in a way, I see the 1848 revolutions as being the end of the Enlightenment and the beginning of a different era. That's how I tend to see it in my own mind. It'd be hard to convince other people to accept that timeline. Romanticism, well, Romanticism is just another tendency. I mean, other tendencies are going on all the time. It's a tendency in literature and the arts, which can have definitely political connotations and political implications. And obviously, as with this mystical King Ludwig of Bavaria, if you were swept away by Romanticism in a powerful way, it could lead to a very reactionary political attitude. But on the other hand, as the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley is one of the most he's a romantic poet, but he's also one of the most radical liberals and enlighteners. He's very keen on Condorcet and on D'Holbach in Britain. I mean, he's really, really keen on what I call radical enlightenment. So I don't think Romanticism in itself inherently steers you in one direction or the other politically, although it's very likely on an individual level to have political implications and maybe reinforce or colour the way in which you pursue your political course. It can go either way.
Who's next? By the way, it's perfectly permissible to disagree as long as it's friendly and constructive disagreement. That's where we sometimes learn and sharpen our arguments. So if somebody here wants to say something in disagreement, I think that would be
That's
okay.
Real democracy. Pierre Bayle wasn't interested in the democracy of the people. He was interested in the democracy of the intellectuals. What is the République des Lettres? It's where everyone can say whatever they want, express themselves in any way they want, except you're not allowed to insult, malign, speak belittlingly of anyone else in the room. As soon as you do that, you should be thrown out. That's what's not allowed.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule of thumb. First of all, I want to take a slight step back and talk for a moment, not as a scholar, but just what we would call the general educated public. Okay, so, but both for a scholar and for the general public, when we say that someone is enlightened, even if we don't differentiate radical, moderate, and so forth, just as a general term, most people agree more or less what an enlightened person is in the beginning of the 21st century. Tolerant, supports the rights of women's rights, increasingly LGBTQ rights today, which was not, when I was born, was still not that acceptable, and all sorts of other...
But Bentham, of course, was a defender of LGBTQ.
But that was very radical then, and it's not as radical today.
But he didn't publicize that point, but he was.
And it's not as radical today, which just shows... So we more or less agree. So that's one observation. However, when we say liberal or liberalism is a much more unclear term. That's why so many political theorists make wonderful careers, because you see more and more books coming out redefining liberalism all the time.
But also, and that was stressed by one of our speakers this morning, maybe that was you, but liberalism means something totally different to Americans from what it means to Europeans. When that is a real obstacle, because Americans are never going to follow what you mean if you start describing liberalism.
I think when I said it, Jean-François was nodding, right? The French, when they look at how Americans discuss liberalism, I would not say European liberalism. It's much closer to what we would think of as quote-unquote classical liberalism or Lockeanism, but when it's like the term republicanism or even socialism. It has so many meanings. It's not, and that's, I think, was the reason that you said that it's unuseful in the Enlightenment that failed. However, it's there as a term, and we can't ignore it. Now, if we take the term Enlightenment and just do what Shmuel was saying, let's talk about, we're still in the history of the Enlightenment. It becomes too much of a thing, and we also can't disregard liberalism. So we're forced by convention to use the term liberalism in a way. Now, here is where I want to say, and one more thing. I think it would be a reasonable assumption if I assume that everybody here, where's the liberal firefly behind me? I don't know if he's a moderate or radical. He's a bit shy now, but he was listening very attentively and he was very excited, if you noticed him. But I think we're all liberals here. I think, but definitely in the Czech Republic, you find too many supporters of something which is socialist in any kind of sense after the history of this country. And I don't know about conservatives, but here, probably, but and it's the kind of thing that you say, I know it when I see it, but if I have to define it. That's why I think seeing it, and I think that's not the only reason, because I think that's actually what happened, seeing liberalism as the continuation of the Enlightenment, grosso modo, it's a very general picture, not only is what happened, but it makes sense and it's constructive for redefining the Enlightenment. Now, some scholars of liberalism have claimed, if you think of Larry Sidenthorpe, that it goes back to Christianity in the Middle Ages, ideas of liberality, or even Elena Rosenblatt has mentioned that. But if we were a bit more precise, a lot of historians, including in the 19th century, like Guizot and Macaulay and others, saw a change beginning, particularly with the Reformation, more than with the Renaissance or the revival of letters, as they call it, before Michelet. But definitely, if we think about the Enlightenment from the 17th century, both the more moderate and definitely what you've written so much about the radical Enlightenment in the Spinozistic circle, not just Spinoza himself, and going into the 18th century. If we just keep talking about it as Enlightenment going into the 19th, the 20th, the 21st century, it loses its distinctness. So when we talk about the Enlightenment, we mean this long 18th century divide. That's one observation I think we can agree on, but sometimes we tend to assume it without making it explicit. To give
I was trying to imply it without stating it outright.
But sometimes maybe we should state it, because People assume that everybody agrees on the premises, and at some point, which is difficult to pinpoint, they're suddenly starting to disagree, and then they have to backtrack to see where did we begin to disagree. I think our disagreements are very subtle.
Very small,
Others would disagree more.
Yeah.
Now, imagine there's I don't know, a river flowing downhill. Maybe it has two streams to the river. One is more radical, one is more moderate. Let's say it began in the 17th century. And this is the river which is continuing to flow today, which leads to what we would assume is a liberal, enlightened society that I hope we all want. And we don't really disagree when we think about it in our own everyday 21st century terms. Okay, and this stream is going downhill. Maybe it's divided in two, but it's still the same water, just in different streams. And then it hits a snag. It hits an obstacle. That obstacle is the revolutionary era. But this is not a dam. The water, like rivers do, finds a different way to flow. Okay. Now, at the same time, we have a new river which actually starts from the same, or a new stream from the same source, from the Enlightenment, and that is the radicalism of socialism, and which starts from the Enlightenment as well. We have to remember that. Conservatism has always been slowly dripping down along. It's always there. Now we have this other stream which is aims for something different, much more radical. But the stream of the Enlightenment, which is now liberalism, is still flowing through the two channels, and I think it maybe even is flowing today. And if we recognize that it began as the Enlightenment and changes because of historical circumstances, not because of its essential attributes, we have a key here to define the liberalism as the continuation of the Enlightenment, which many scholars, I think most scholars, definitely the Marxists, but not just them, have tended to see the revolutionary era as a disruption, not to see continuation.
Yeah.
Historians love interesting stories. Continuation is boring. It's the same thing, it continues. But many times that's what happens. So that's my general observation of what's happening and why it is okay to, and actually helpful to redefine liberalism as the continuation of the Enlightenment in both these moderate and radical terms. I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely, except one small aspect of what you just said seemed to suggest that you see the radicals as opposed to radical liberals as being more radical in certain respects. Well, they were in certain respects, but I think there were also other respects. Remember what Sismondi had to say about American society in the 1840s and how the blacks were treated. I don't think at that stage anarchists or socialists were interested in colonial or racial issues to the same extent as radical liberals
But
were.
you see how today they are the most, post-anti-colonialist and so forth comes usually from the neo-Marxists, generally speaking. They caught up in that sense.
Yeah, but we're talking about the 1840s, 1830s and 40s, and I think that the radical liberals had a wider perspective, let's say, than, and this is what Aruga objected to in Marx, that his focus has a certain, he's a great man, Karl Marx, in many ways, an amazing intellectual, vast scope, and yet there was something narrow about his preoccupations which exasperated Ruger, because the requirements, the needs of a freer, more liberated, constitutionally more flexible and more comprehensive state seemed to him much wider than anything that the Marxists were proposing, who was so focused on economic issues.
Anyone else? Don't hesitate. Yes, Pablo.
Thank you. Can I disagree with you, Nati, instead of, or maybe the two of you? Just with the detail that the French Revolution, from your own perspective, cannot be an obstacle because it's made of water itself. Also,
it's made of what?
Of water. I mean, if this is just a stream, what we're dealing with.
No, the French Revolution was the obstacle. Not just the French Revolution, the whole revolutionary era which was a disappointment for many who had expected it to succeed. Like look at the Netherlands, where it didn't succeed.
But from the framework that you present, if socialism is also part originally of one single stream of liquid water, you cannot say that the French Revolution is not made of the same kind of water too. So how do you avoid that small problem that the French Revolution is also part of the radical Enlightenment as a result of it? You cannot be avoided as such.
I agree with you. I think that, when Benjamin Constant says, well, you can't just measure the French Revolution in terms of the terror and of Robespierre, because the French Revolution is much more than that. And if you look at it from the perspective of, ending slavery in Haiti, or ending the changes that came about in Germany and the Low Countries that introduced by Napoleon, you can't, or for that matter, the changes that 1815 introduced in France. I think Constant's right. Of course, there are things to be frightened of and to regret the excesses of the French Revolution, but you can't, from a liberal point of view, you can't say that the French Revolution was completely a failure. That would be surely wrong.
I would add that according to liberal historians in France, definitely, including more radical ones like Lamartine and Michelet.
Michelet, yeah.
And even slightly more moderate ones like Quesnay and Mignet and Ladortière and others. They saw the terror as the betrayal of the revolution.
Exactly. Well, all liberals would see the terror as a betrayal.
The whole point was that was why many, and here maybe I have a slight disagreement, I think it was much more common to see radicals who, because, particularly those who lived, straddled both centuries, who weren't born like Tocqueville and Mill and others, basically at the beginning of the 19th century, but like Constant or Madame de Stael or others who were born and saw the revolution as grown-ups and then lived into the beginning of liberalism. For them, it was like a cautionary tale. We can't let democracy now, because then we'll end up with Robespierre, not with Brissot and Condorcet. So this dealt a real delaying blow, but where many historians see this as a disruption that created a completely new world, I think that this continuing water definitely continued to drip down and found this new tract around this. If the image works, and if this
Can be a stone.
they hear the metaphor is I won't start mixing metaphors, but
I don't think we should spend too much time on metaphors. After all, we're talking about people, not water.
Yeah. But I will just to give an example, and that puts romanticism inside it. If you look at the Lake poets, all three of the major ones, Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Robert Southey, who is a very interesting social commentator, start out as radicals. What does Wordsworth write when he's in Paris, when they're dismantling the Bastille and he takes a stone from the Bastille? What joy was it then to be alive? Those famous lines from his Prelude, his autobiographical poem. But 20 years later, he's a reactionary conservative.
Yes.
And Southey is a paternalist socialist, and the same thing. The third one, I had him in a moment ago. Coleridge. Yeah. All of them
were radical when they were young. And Spinoza's when they were young as well.
Yeah, that I didn't know. But,
do you know the joke? Apparently they were, I think somewhere in the West Country in England, they were sitting in a pub having a discussion, and the Home Office in London was a bit worried about these young poets and literary people. There seemed to be something subversive going on. So they sent a spy to sit at the table next to them and listen and report on what they're discussing. And he said that there are a lot of disturbing features of their conversation, and you should particularly look out. There is this dangerous spy who's called Spinoza.
A spy with a nose.
And he seems to be a really serious threat.
A nosy spy.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I'll count to 10 in my head in case someone is hesitating and will change their mind. So I think this is a good place to stop. This has been a wonderful discussion and a wonderful conference. And it gives you the sense, the appetite for more, that we're just beginning to discuss this topic, and hopefully it will be picked up. And maybe the publication, if we can bring it to fruition, will help turn what seems like a modest conference in a small university in Central Europe to be an event in scholarship.
Well, let me speak for all the participants in the conference once again, and thank you and thank Tomasz for really a marvelous experience yesterday and today. I think we should applaud them. Don't you think so? Yes.